Something is wrong with the world. You feel it. Not as abstract political opinion, as visceral, persistent discomfort. You open your phone and see power being exercised over the defenseless, and the people with the power are smiling. You watch crowds cheer for policies that will destroy lives they will never have to witness. You see suffering broadcast in real time while institutions deliberate over whether it qualifies as suffering. And underneath all of it, a question forms that no headline answers. How is this possible? Not strategically, not politically. How is it possible that human beings do this to other human beings and feel justified? That question is older than any current event, but it has never felt more urgent than now. The easy answer is the one we always reach for: monsters. Exceptional people with exceptional pathology. Sadists, psychopaths, ideologues so corrupted they no longer register as fully human. We need that answer because it contains the problem. If cruelty belongs to monsters, then the world is dangerous but comprehensible. The bad are bad. The rest of us are not. The line is clear. But the line has never been clear. And the history of human cruelty, not the exceptional history, the ordinary history, suggests something far more disturbing. The people who built and operated systems of mass suffering were, in most measurable ways, unremarkable. They had families. They followed rules. They believed, most of them, that what they were doing was necessary. Some believed it was good. The monster is a story we tell to avoid a harder one. The harder story is philosophical. It asks not who did this, but what in human nature makes this possible, repeatedly across cultures, across centuries, across every form of civilization we have managed to construct. Thinkers from Nietzsche to Freud to Hannah Arendt to Erich Fromm spent their lives pulling at this thread. What they found doesn't comfort, but it explains. And in a world that looks the way ours looks right now, explanation is not a luxury. It is the only honest starting point. This video is that starting point. By the end, you will understand the psychological and philosophical architecture of human cruelty, where it comes from, how it operates, why it persists, and why the people committing it almost never see it as cruelty at all. You will see the mechanisms clearly enough to recognize them, in systems, in crowds, in ideologies, and eventually, uncomfortably, in yourself. That last part is not optional. It is the point. Cruelty is not what happens when civilization breaks down. It is what civilization was built to manage, and has never fully contained. This is the premise that most people refuse. We prefer the narrative of progress, that human beings are fundamentally decent, that violence and cruelty are remnants of a more primitive past, that every war, every atrocity, every system of organized oppression is a failure of the project rather than evidence of something the project cannot erase. It is a comforting narrative. It is also contradicted by everything we know about human nature, from evolutionary biology to depth psychology, to the unbroken historical record of what people do to each other when conditions permit. Freud saw it clearly, even if it disturbed him to say so. Late in his thinking, he proposed that alongside the drive toward life, connection, creation, eros, there exists an opposing force he called Todestrieb, the death drive, an impulse toward dissolution, destruction, the reduction of tension through annihilation, not a pathology, a structural feature. Freud didn't celebrate this. He found it tragic, but he refused to look away from it, because looking away had consequences. Civilization, in his framework, is the ongoing and exhausting negotiation between these two forces. And the negotiation is never finished, never won. Nietzsche approached it from a different angle. For him, the will to power, the drive to assert, dominate, expand, was not the corruption of human nature, but its engine. The problem was not that humans wanted power. The problem was what they did when that desire was denied, suppressed, or turned inward. Cruelty, in Nietzsche's reading, is often redirected power. The force that cannot express itself outward turned against others in sanctioned ways, dressed in the language of morality, justice, or necessity. The cruelest actors in history rarely thought of themselves as cruel. They thought of themselves as strong, or righteous, or simply doing what had to be done. Primatology adds a layer that philosophy alone cannot. Frans de Waal spent decades studying chimpanzees and bonobos, our closest living relatives, and found that dominance, coalition, exclusion, and calculated aggression are not aberrations in primate social life. They are organizing principles. The capacity for cruelty is not a bug introduced by culture. It is older than culture. It is part of the inheritance. What separates us from other primates is not the absence of these drives. It is the complexity of the systems we build around them. Legal, moral, religious, social. Those systems can suppress cruelty, redirect it, make it costly. But they can also, under the right conditions, license it, amplify it, give it a uniform and a flag and an ideology and call it order. The question was never whether the capacity for cruelty exists in human nature. It does. The question is, what activates it? What psychological mechanisms turn that latent capacity into action in ordinary people living ordinary lives? And those mechanisms are more familiar than you want them to be. That's where we go next. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Nobody thinks of themselves as the villain. This is not self-deception in the clinical sense. It is something more structural, a feature of how cruelty actually operates at scale. The person causing harm almost never experiences themselves as causing harm. They experience themselves as following procedure, maintaining order, defending their group, delivering justice, or simply doing what everyone around them is doing. The subjective experience of cruelty from the inside rarely feels like cruelty. It feels like a necessity. Hannah Arendt watched Adolf Eichmann stand trial for his role in coordinating the logistics of the Holocaust and recorded something that unsettled her more than rage could have. He was ordinary. He spoke in clichés. He hadn't hated his victims with burning passion. He had processed them as an administrative problem and solved it efficiently. What was absent in him wasn't morality in the abstract. It was the habit of thinking, the practice of pausing to ask what his actions meant for the human beings on the receiving end. Arendt called this the banality of evil. Not evil as an exceptional force. Evil as the absence of thought, operating inside perfectly normal people, within perfectly normal systems. Decades of social psychology have since mapped the specific mechanisms that make this possible. Stanley Milgram demonstrated that 65% of ordinary people would administer what they believed to be potentially lethal electric shocks to a stranger, not out of sadism, but because an authority figure instructed them to continue. Most showed visible distress. Most continued anyway. The authority didn't override their conscience. It gave them permission to override it themselves. Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment showed something adjacent and equally disturbing. Students assigned the role of prison guards became systematically cruel within days, not because they were selected for cruelty, but because the role normalized it and the group sustained it. No one ordered them to humiliate. The situation did. And the situation, it turns out, is more powerful than character in ways that most people find deeply uncomfortable to accept. Then there is dehumanization, perhaps the oldest and most reliable mechanism of all. When a group is defined through language that strips them of full humanity, something measurable shifts in how the brain processes them. Empathy doesn't fully engage. Suffering doesn't fully register. This is not a metaphor. It is neuroscience. And it begins not with violence, but with words, with the slow, normalized redefinition of a group as something less than human. The violence, when it comes, feels almost logical. What connects all of these mechanisms, obedience, conformity, dehumanization, the fragmentation of responsibility across bureaucratic systems, is that none of them require bad people. They require ordinary people inside structures designed to distribute moral weight until it becomes weightless. Structures that reward compliance and punish dissent. Structures that keep the person causing harm far enough from the person being harmed that the connection never has to be felt. Those structures are not historical artifacts. They are the architecture of the present. And the cruelty they produce today doesn't look like uniforms and camps. It looks like systems. It looks like policy. It looks like the clean, laundered face of institutional power, which is exactly where we go next. The most effective cruelty leaves no fingerprints. This is what distinguishes the cruelty of the present from the cruelty of the past. Not its scale, not its intensity, but its architecture. Historical atrocities are legible in retrospect. We can point to the perpetrators, name the ideology, trace the chain of command. But the cruelty that operates today is engineered precisely to resist that kind of legibility. It is distributed across systems so complex, chains of causation so long, layers of institutional mediation so thick that the question of who is responsible becomes genuinely difficult to answer. And that difficulty is not accidental. It is the point. Consider what power looks like when it operates without accountability. Decisions made in boardrooms and legislative chambers that determine whether millions of people have housing, healthcare, safety, dignity, made by people who will never meet those millions, never see their faces, never feel the weight of what those decisions produce at the human level. Distance is built into the structure, and distance, as Milgram showed, is what makes harm feel permissible. The executive who signs the policy that destroys a community is not lying awake at night. The mechanism ensures they don't have to. The same logic operates through ideology. Every system that causes mass suffering comes equipped with a narrative that explains why the suffering is necessary, deserved, or simply the unavoidable cost of something more important. The people being harmed are framed as threats, as burdens, as lesser. Not through explicit dehumanization always, but through the steady, normalized language of policy and economics and national interest. The cruelty is laundered through abstraction until it no longer looks like cruelty. It looks like governance. Digital space has added a new dimension that Arendt could not have anticipated. The distance that bureaucracy creates physically, technology creates instantaneously. A coordinated campaign can destroy a person's life, their reputation, their relationships, their livelihood, their sense of safety. And the thousands of people participating in it each contribute so little, individually, that none of them feel responsible for the totality. Each one sends a message, makes a comment, shares a post. Each one is just responding. The fragmentation of responsibility that Zimbardo and Milgram observed in laboratory conditions now operates at civilizational scale, in real time, with no authority figure required. The crowd is the authority. And then there is the cruelty of the spectator, perhaps the most widespread form of all. You see suffering that is real, documented, undeniable. You understand at some level that it is connected to systems you participate in, that your consumption, your silence, your vote, your indifference are not neutral. And you continue. Not because you are monstrous, because the psychological cost of fully feeling the connection between your life and that suffering is higher than you are willing to pay. Fromm called this the escape from freedom, the retreat into conformity and passivity because genuine moral engagement is too heavy to sustain. This is the cruelty that wears a clean face. It doesn't require hatred. It doesn't require intention. It requires only that enough people remain comfortable enough, distant enough, and busy enough to never look directly at what the system is doing in the space between their choices and someone else's suffering. But there is something beneath even this that the analysis so far has avoided naming. Because the mechanisms we've described, obedience, conformity, distance, institutional diffusion, suggest that cruelty is something people fall into under pressure, something that happens to them. And that is only half the truth. The other half is darker. Sometimes cruelty is not a mechanism we're caught inside. Sometimes it is something we reach for, something we enjoy. That is where we go next. This is the part nobody wants to arrive at. Everything so far has offered a kind of refuge. Cruelty as evolutionary inheritance. Cruelty as psychological mechanism, cruelty as systemic architecture. These frameworks are true, and they are also, subtly, comforting. Because they position you as someone who might be caught inside a system, swept along by conformity, numbed by distance, a victim of conditions. But there is a form of cruelty that none of those frameworks explain. The kind you choose, the kind that feels good. You know the feeling. Someone powerful and seemingly untouchable is exposed. Their crimes made public, their carefully constructed image collapsed, and something in you responds that isn't quite justice. It's warmer than justice, more satisfying. You watch the pile-on and you don't look away. You share the story. You add your voice to the chorus. And underneath the moral language you use to describe what you're doing, accountability, consequences, truth, there is a current of pleasure that you don't fully examine because examining it would cost you something. The Germans have a word for it. Schadenfreude. Joy at another's suffering. It is so universally human that it required its own vocabulary. But Erich Fromm went further than naming it. He identified what he called the necrophilous character, not necrophilia in the clinical sense, but a psychological orientation toward destruction, control, and the reduction of living things to manageable dead categories. In his framework, this isn't rare psychopathology. It exists on a spectrum, and modern culture, with its appetite for humiliation, its engineered outrage, its commodification of suffering as content, sits closer to that end of the spectrum than we acknowledge. The cancel culture phenomenon is worth examining here, not politically, but psychologically. When someone transgresses, genuinely or perceived, the response that emerges from crowds is rarely proportional. It is total. The goal stops being accountability and becomes annihilation. Loss of livelihood, relationships, reputation, sometimes safety. And the people participating feel not cruelty, but righteousness. The pleasure of punishment is real, measurable, neurologically confirmed. The same reward circuitry that lights up for food and sex activates when we watch someone we've judged get what we've decided they deserve. Cruelty, when framed as justice, produces genuine satisfaction. That is not an accusation. It is a description of how the brain works. Nietzsche saw this clearly and named it without mercy. He identified what he called ressentiment, the particular psychology of those who cannot express power directly, and so convert their frustration into moral condemnation. The weak, unable to dominate, learn to punish through judgment. The cruelty doesn't disappear. It finds a socially acceptable channel. And the more righteous the cause, the more license it provides. History's most sustained cruelties have almost always been carried out by people who believed, with complete sincerity, that they were on the right side. This is the darkest thread in the psychology of cruelty, that it is not always a failure of our better nature. Sometimes it is an expression of something in us that finds satisfaction in dominance, in punishment, in the reduction of another person to a target. The mechanisms of the previous sections describe how ordinary people are pulled into cruelty by systems and situations. But this section names something those mechanisms cannot fully explain. The part of you that sometimes doesn't need to be pulled. The part that moves toward it. Recognizing that is not self-condemnation. It is the beginning of the only question that matters. The one Arendt left open and no one has answered comfortably since. Which is exactly where we go next. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. You have been watching the world from a safe distance this entire video. That distance was necessary. To see the mechanisms clearly, to understand the systems, to trace the psychology without the fog of defensiveness. But the distance ends here. Because everything described so far, the evolutionary inheritance, the obedience, the dehumanization, the pleasure of punishment, the comfort of conformity, none of it is about other people. It is a portrait of a species, and you are a member of it. So the question Arendt left hanging over the Eichmann trial, the question she never answered because she understood it could not be answered honestly from the outside, is this. What makes you believe you would have been different, not in the abstract, concretely, under the same conditions, the same authority structure, the same ideological environment, the same social pressure, the same distance from the people being harmed? The same slow normalization that makes each step feel like a small and reasonable extension of the last. What, precisely, is the thing in you that would have held? Most people answer this question with character, with values, with the sense that they possess some moral core that would have resisted. But Milgram's research doesn't support that. Zimbardo's research doesn't support that. The historical record doesn't support that. What those bodies of evidence suggest, consistently and uncomfortably, is that character, as a fixed, reliable inner resource, is far weaker than situation. That the majority of people, under the right conditions, comply, conform, stay silent, and find, afterward, ways to explain why that was the reasonable thing to do. This is not nihilism. It is not the claim that moral resistance is impossible. It is the claim that moral resistance is not a trait you either have or don't have. It is a practice, costly, effortful, continuous, and never finished. The people who did resist, in every historical context where resistance was possible and dangerous, were not people with superior character in some innate sense. They were people who had cultivated specific habits, the habit of thinking past the immediate pressure, the habit of identifying with the person being harmed rather than the authority giving the order, the habit of paying the social cost of dissent rather than absorbing it silently. Those habits are not natural. They run against the grain of every psychological mechanism this video has described. They require you to feel the weight of moral responsibility in situations specifically designed to diffuse it, to maintain empathy for people that systems and ideologies are actively working to define as undeserving of it. To be the one who names what is happening when everyone around you has agreed, tacitly, to call it something else. Arendt's deepest argument was not about evil. It was about thinking. The suspension of genuine thought, the retreat into role, into procedure, into the comfort of consensus, is what makes ordinary cruelty possible. And thinking, in her sense, is not intellectual sophistication. It is the willingness to stop and ask what you are actually doing and what it means for the person it is being done to. That question, asked honestly and consistently, is the only reliable obstacle to the machinery this video has described. The question is whether you are willing to ask it, not once, as an insight, every time, in the small moments before the large ones become possible. Because the large moments don't arrive without the small ones first. And the small ones are happening right now. In the world you opened this video trying to understand. What you do with that understanding is the only thing left. And that is exactly where we end. Understanding cruelty does not make you innocent. This is the thing that sophisticated analysis can quietly obscure. You have spent this video developing a framework, evolutionary, psychological, philosophical, and frameworks create a particular kind of distance. The distance of the observer. The person who understands the mechanism is not the person caught inside it, except that is precisely the illusion that Arendt spent her career dismantling. Understanding the machinery of cruelty while remaining a functional part of it is not wisdom. It is the most refined form of the evasion this video has been describing all along. So here is what is actually true. The world you opened this video trying to understand, the power exercised over the defenseless, the crowds applauding exclusion, the suffering processed as spectacle, is not a world that exists separately from you. It is sustained in part by the same mechanisms operating in you, by the distance you maintain, by the discomfort you choose not to sit with, by the small dehumanizations you allow to pass without naming them, by the cruelty you have felt and enjoyed and explained to yourself as something else. Fromm argued that the most dangerous human being is not the one who chooses evil consciously. It is the one who has simply stopped choosing, who drifts through systems and roles and group consensus without ever exercising the friction of genuine moral thought. That drift is comfortable. It is socially rewarded. It is, in most contexts, the path of least resistance. And it is how the machinery keeps running. The hardest truth this video has been building toward is not that humans are cruel. It is that you have the capacity for cruelty that you have not fully accounted for. Not as abstract possibility, as lived reality, in what you have enjoyed, in what you have ignored, in where you have deferred when you knew, at some level, that deferral was a moral choice. The question is not whether that capacity exists in you. It does. The question is what you do with the knowledge that it does. Arendt's answer was thinking. Not as intellectual exercise, but as moral practice, the stubborn, costly refusal to stop asking what your actions mean for the person they affect. Nietzsche's answer was honesty, the willingness to see yourself without the flattering narrative, to know your drives without pretending they are something cleaner. Fromm's answer was love in the most demanding sense, the active, effortful orientation toward life rather than toward control and destruction. None of these are easy. None of them are finished. All of them require you to become someone who is willing to be uncomfortable in ways that the world is specifically designed to help you avoid. This is not a call to guilt. Guilt is cheap and static. It keeps you focused on yourself rather than on what needs to change. This is a call to something harder, accountability that moves. The recognition that you are not a passive witness to the cruelty of the world, and that the mirror this video has been holding up reflects not just what humans are capable of, but what you are responsible for. Starting now, in the next small moment where the choice is available. If something in this video named something you recognized but had never said out loud, leave it in the comments, not to perform reflection, because saying it is the beginning of the only work that matters. And if you want to understand what happens when that work is refused, when the capacity for self-knowledge exists and is deliberately turned away from, the next video is waiting. Don't look away now.